Something big is happening in the automotive world, and Bugatti is right at the center of it. Two high-profile cases, Matt Armstrong's Chiron rebuild and Mark McCung's broken Veyron, have pulled back the curtain on how Bugatti treats independent repairs. And with sweeping EU right-to-repair legislation coming into effect in July 2026, the manufacturer may no longer have the luxury of operating the way it has been. Let's break down both stories, what they reveal, and why the regulations being introduced could force one of the world's most exclusive car brands to fundamentally change how it does business. Matt Armstrong was approached to rebuild a crashed Bugatti Chiron owned by FXG. From the very beginning, Bugatti made its position clear. It would not supply any parts for the rebuild, and it did not recognize independent garages as qualified to carry out the work. Bugatti's CEO, Mate Rimac, went as far as releasing a public video explaining the company's stance.
Chiron, there's so many electrical wires, piping, oil piping, water piping, fuel lines that connect from the monocoque to the rear section, and they have to split the car in half. You can't do that in a garage. There's just a few places in the world with the right equipment and only a few people in the world with the right training to be able to do that.
According to Rimac, only a handful of locations in the world had the equipment necessary to work on a Chiron, and only a small number of people had the training required to do it properly. Bugatti's official position was that the car couldn't even be split, meaning separated at the engine and gearbox, outside of two specialized facilities anywhere in the world. Matt's response was to get to work anyway. Bob the welder repaired the gearbox mounting bracket and reinforced it to a strength beyond factory specification. Specialists restored all 4 damaged radiators. The aluminum front structure was 3D scanned and recreated using CNC machining. A fully custom exhaust system was developed by Valvetronic. And as for splitting the car, Matt did it in a regular garage in Miami, using standard tools, with no specialized facility in sight. When the Chiron fired up on the first key turn, with the gearbox engaging cleanly and every rebuilt system performing exactly as intended, Bugatti's core claim had been directly contradicted in front of millions of viewers. The restriction on independent repairs wasn't about technical necessity. It was about control. What makes Matt's success particularly significant isn't just that he pulled it off, it's that he pulled it off entirely without Bugatti's help. Every part, every solution, every workaround came from independent effort because Bugatti refused to support the project from day one. The rebuild didn't happen despite the restrictions. It happened in spite of them. While Matt was proving Bugatti wrong on the Chiron, Mark McCung found himself caught in an entirely different kind of frustration, one that had nothing to do with technical capability and everything to do with access. Mark purchased what was reportedly the cheapest Bugatti Veyron in the world, a Mansory Pang edition, for $900,000. The car had been sitting in pieces for over 3 years and came with a completely failed gearbox. Forward gears wouldn't engage. Reverse was gone. The car was, for all practical purposes, undrivable. The estimated cost of a replacement gearbox, somewhere between $200,000 and $300,000, depending on the variant. That's not a comfortable number, but for someone who just bought a Bugatti Veyron, it's at least a known territory. The real problem wasn't the price, it was that Mark couldn't even get a quote. He called Bugatti Manchester. They redirected him to Bugatti London. He called Bugatti London and reached voicemail. He tried again, eventually got through to the parts department, and was told they'd check availability and call back with pricing within a day or two. That was over a month ago. No callback ever came. For context, Mark reached out to BMW in the same period and received a complete gearbox quote for an F80 M3 in under 2 minutes. One of the world's largest car manufacturers responded faster, more clearly, and more professionally than Bugatti did for a part worth potentially $300,000. When Mark finally managed to get a Bugatti representative on the phone, the explanation he received raised more questions than it answered. The gearbox, he was told, is a sealed unit. It cannot be opened or repaired internally. Even if the fault turns out to be something as minor as a worn bearing worth a few $100s, Bugatti's policy is full replacement only. No partial repair, no diagnostic opening, no exceptions. Mark also asked why there was a gap of up to $100,000 between the two gearbox variants. The answer he received offered no real explanation, only that certain Veyron configurations require the more expensive unit. That's a six-figure price difference with no technical justification provided to the customer footing the bill. The representative also noted that because someone had already partially disassembled the car before Mark bought it, Bugatti couldn't take responsibility for anything until they took over the entire process themselves. Which, of course, means Bugatti's own technicians, Bugatti's own facilities, and Bugatti's own pricing, with no alternative available to the customer. That's the pattern in plain sight. Refuse to support independent work, then use the existence of that independent work as a reason to demand full control of the repair. The customer is left with no leverage and no options. Here's where the story shifts from frustrating to consequential. EU right to repair legislation, taking effect in July 2026, is specifically designed to dismantle the kind of manufacturer control both Matt and Mark have been dealing with. Under the new rules, manufacturers will be required to give independent repairers and vehicle owners access to spare parts, repair tools, and technical documentation for a minimum of 5 to 7 years after a model goes out of production. In practical terms, this means Bugatti will no longer be able to refuse gearbox sales to independent garages. They will no longer be able to hide behind sealed components as a reason to block repairs. They will no longer be able to leave customers waiting for over a month without so much as a price quote for a part. And they will no longer be able to funnel customers into authorized dealer networks by deliberately withholding the information and components needed to go anywhere else. Each of those behaviors, restricting parts access, questioning independent capability without evidence, limiting diagnostic tools and repair data, and forcing customers into controlled service networks, is directly addressed by the incoming legislation. All of it becomes non-compliant in July 2026. It would be easy to look at both situations and see them as isolated incidents involving exotic cars that most people will never own. But the principle at stake applies far beyond Bugatti and far beyond cars in the $1 million to $3 million price range. When a manufacturer controls every part, every tool, every piece of documentation, and every authorized repairer, the customer doesn't actually own the car, not in any meaningful sense. They own the object, but the manufacturer owns the ability to keep it running. That's the dynamic Mark McCung is living right now. His Veyron is sitting unusable because the only entity that can supply a replacement gearbox has been unreachable for over a month and hasn't offered an explanation for why. Matt Armstrong's rebuild demonstrated that the technical barriers Bugatti described were never as absolute as the company presented them to be. Skilled independent specialists, using modern tools and engineering ingenuity, can work on these cars. The question was never really whether it could be done, it was whether Bugatti would allow it to be done. The EU legislation answers that question legally. Manufacturers no longer get to make that choice unilaterally. For a brand like Bugatti, compliance with these regulations isn't a minor operational tweak. It's a structural change to how the business works. Bugatti will need to make parts available to qualified independent repairers, not just to its own authorized network. It will need to supply access to specialized diagnostic tools and systems. It will be required to provide technical documentation, repair data, and the information necessary for someone outside Bugatti's network to carry out legitimate repairs. And all of this must remain available for years after production of a model ends. Right now, customers like Mark have no realistic alternative to Bugatti. The gearbox doesn't exist anywhere else. The supply chain runs entirely through the manufacturer. So Bugatti sets the price, controls the timeline, and determines whether a repair happens at all. That's not a market, it's a captive system. Once the regulations take effect, that captive system ends. Independent repairers gain legal access to parts and information. Customers gain the ability to seek alternatives. And Bugatti loses the structural advantage it has used to maintain total control over the ownership experience. Matt Armstrong proved that independent capability is real. Mark McCung is showing, in real time, what happens when that capability is systematically blocked. Together, their stories explain exactly why these regulations exist and why they're necessary. July 2026 is the deadline. Bugatti will either adapt to the new framework willingly, or it will be pushed into compliance through exactly the kind of public cases that have already put its practices under scrutiny. Either way, the era of complete manufacturer control over parts, repairs, and access is coming to an end. Subscribe for more coverage as these stories develop, because how Bugatti responds to these changes will tell us a great deal about whether the company is truly built around its customers or simply built around control.